Not sure if this applies here, but it's one parent, not both. Buckle up, it's gonna be a long one. So, like I said, I was in an accident. The doctor told my mother she'd never have kids. Then I came along. My dad was young and she was 6-ish years older than him. We'll leave it at that. After I was born, she actually had something to do with me. That was until she met her now current husband. She tried to tell me he was my biological dad and kept pressuring me at 2 years old that he was, in fact, my father. At the same time, my bio dad had visitation every other weekend, and she claimed he was just a friend. He eventually told me. My mother was livid. 2 years later, she had another kid, my half-brother, and that's when her manipulation really kicked off. At 4 years old, I was changing diapers, getting my brother dressed, even waking up in the middle of the night when he cried to make him bottles. Potty training, formula, diaper changing, and so on. All that were up to me. She told me that this was normal and that older brothers are supposed to set an example. Meanwhile, I was off and on seeing my dad every other weekend. She hated it. I would tell me that he wasn't coming to pick me up or that he didn't care. In reality, he'd call to ask to have me on his weekend, and she would flat out say no, even going as far as to take me to a meetup spot that was more of a drive for my dad than it was for her, just to prove to me that he wasn't coming. This continued for several years. I'd take care of my brother, started doing small chores that led to full-on cleaning the house, and then she got pregnant again, and the cycle restarted. My second brother wasn't as bad. Not as bad as my first, but I had to say that I started to loathe them both. While they had brand new shoes, clothes, and so on, I got hand-me-downs. I wore shoes that the soles were falling apart. I literally had to duct tape them together just so that I could walk in them. There is more in between, but if I continued with the physical and mental abuse this woman caused me, this post would be longer than it's going to be. I'll just fast forward to when I was 13, about to be 14, when I finally had enough. At this time, I had swapped custody between my bio mother and my dad because of issues my mother caused, such as moving out of state, which at the time was against the court order, and my dad made a mistake which had been resolved by this point. Nobody's perfect. At this time, I was in homeschool, failing every class because my public school had sent me to the hospital. Although she was a stay-at-home mother, she was unreachable, and it was assumed that I had gone to school with appendicitis. I attempted to tell her before I went to school that I didn't feel good, but she said I was faking it, resulting in me staying in the hospital for 8 hours by myself until I convinced the nurse and doctor to contact my school counselor so I could go home, since I just had swelling in my lymph nodes. I had my eyes open by this point, and I finally told my dad I wanted to come home and started a fight with my bio mother because I had enough. She would then call my dad and ask, "Do you freaking want him?" As if I was just property to her. Needless to say, yes, he did. And after a long, awkward 2 weeks, I was shipped on a plane headed towards the east. Dad had moved states too, as the state we are originally from is, well, dumb on the west of the country. After a long story, too long to make short, I came to where I call home, got my grades up, and graduated. My dad remarried to this awesome woman that, although is my stepmother, I just call her mom. And the bio dad, well, no one has heard anything more than a happy insert special day here, and eventually nothing at all. Now after 10 years, I say to this day I'm doing better. No, it wasn't a they or ride into the sunset story because those do not exist. We had our ups and downs as any normal person would, but overall, way better than the abuse I was in. I realized recently that I may have residual trauma when an innocent event made me flinch and took me back to when I was that kid that had to bow before the highness herself. So I started therapy, and after talking to a friend, they said maybe I should post it here. There was a lot more abuse that happened to me as a child, and I may share my story and explain. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. I apologize for my story being long and maybe not making sense in places, but I want to end this with a message I have learned from this. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. And no matter what you go through, you will always find a way to grow and strengthen yourself, even when you feel weak. After all, even a black sheep's wool is found useful in other aspects. I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of a showdown with an entitled Karen, but life has a funny way of surprising you. It all started on a regular Tuesday afternoon as I pulled into the parking lot of the local grocery store. The sun was shining and everything seemed peaceful until I spotted her. A woman who would soon become the star of my unexpected adventure. Karen, as I would later come to know her, had parked her shiny SUV right in the handicapped spot, without a care in the world. No disabled sticker, no visible sign of any physical ailment. Just sheer entitlement. Now, as someone who relies on that spot due to my disability, this struck a nerve. I sat in my car for a moment debating whether to let it slide or do something about it. But something inside me snapped, and I decided it was time to stand up for what was right. I parked my car right behind hers and proceeded to plug her in. It wasn't the most graceful blockade, but it got the job done. And I just sat there in my car and waited. Just as I secured my position, Karen came out of the store, laden with shopping bags and a scowl that could curdle milk. Our exchange went something like this. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" "Plugging you in, Karen. You're parked in a handicapped spot without a permit. Not cool." "I don't need a permit. I was in a hurry." "Doesn't excuse breaking the law. I've already called the cops. They all sorted it out." The color drained from Karen's face as she realized her mistake. But rather than accept the consequences, she decided to take matters into her own hands. "You think you can just trap me? I'll show you." She stormed towards my car. I locked my doors, expecting a verbal tirade, but she surprised me. With nothing but sheer stupidity, Karen started pushing against my car, trying to free herself. "Are you serious right now?" "Move your damn car." "Not until the police arrive. You'll get your ticket soon enough." Her frustration reached a breaking point, and she rushed to my window, pounding on it like a mad woman. I feared the glass might shatter. "I demand you move. I have places to be." "You should have thought about that before breaking the law." Suddenly, Karen had a misguided burst of inspiration. She sprinted back to her SUV, started the engine, and reversed as hard as she could, crashing into my car. The impact rocked me in my seat, and for a moment I feared for my safety. She repeated this reckless maneuver a few times, using her car as a battering ram against mine. I contemplated calling the whole thing off, but my stubbornness got the best of me. I held my ground, even as her madness escalated. There was no going back now. Finally, she managed to wedge her car free. With a victorious sneer, she sped away, leaving me shaken and shocked. Little did she know that her escape plan was about to drop off a cliff. As she tried to pull out of the parking lot, she found herself crashing head-on with a police cruiser that was dispatched to my call. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass filled the air. The police officer, slightly dazed but quickly recovering, rushed to Karen's crumbled car. I rolled over to witness the aftermath, watching as they checked on her and called for medical assistance. Officer 1 asks, "Ma'am, are you okay?" Karen, disoriented and nursing a burgeoning headache, could only mumble incoherently. Officer 2 says, "Looks like we've got a collision here." They take a good look at her car and plate number and realize that this is the car they were called for. One of them says, "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us once the EMTs give the green light." EMTs arrived, examined Karen and deemed it necessary to take her to the hospital for further evaluation. I got checked as well by the EMTs, but I was fine thankfully. And I pressed charges without a moment's hesitation, determined to see this through to the end. In the coming days, I would learn that her insurance covered the damages to my car. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but a satisfying one nonetheless. Karen, on the other hand, faced consequences she couldn't escape. The judge assigned to her case didn't take kindly to her reckless actions. She was sentenced to a year in prison, a fitting punishment for someone who thought they were above the law. Fines piled up and the weight of her entitlement finally came crashing down on her. As for me, I continued my daily life a bit wiser and with a newfound appreciation for what I stood up for on that day. I'm 29 female, my sister-in-law 33 female lives in the same community as me and my husband 32 male. She and her husband had plans to come by our home after they came back from picking up their 1-year-old son from her mom's house. When they arrived, she was extremely angry and distraught and explained that her husband dropped her and the baby off while he looked for parking. But she saw a spot open up nearby, so she tried to hold it by standing in a spot with her son in a stroller. A man got to the spot first and started to back his car into the spot despite seeing her and the baby there, and she was forced to move out of the way. She said she went off on him, cursing and saying that he's an evil person to steal a parking spot from a baby and to endanger them by backing into the spot. The man apparently gave her a big F you and said her name isn't on a spot. Honestly, I wanted to stay neutral on the matter, especially after my husband confirmed with her and via house camera that the man very slowly backed in and clearly was not trying to run them over. Sister-in-law was clearly upset and shaken up over it, but she kept talking about how awful the man was hours and hours after they arrived. And her husband kept validating her, which made her feel like my husband and I would be on the same page. She kept asking for our input, and we kept skirting around it with plenty of "that's crazy" and "we're so sorry that happened to you." I had enough of it and told her that I'm sorry that this happened to you and that I understand that it was scary. But even though it wasn't her intent, she was the one endangering her child by forcing herself and baby into the road to hold a spot. There were plenty of other parking spots. She should know as she lives in the neighborhood, and she can't assume that everyone will pass her by when they see her holding a spot just because she has a baby. What if the man got angry and backed in without giving her time to move? I also told her that she can't force anyone to not take a public parking spot. She got huffy and said that she knew I wouldn't understand because I'm not a parent and that I can't comprehend how traumatic the experience was for her. Her husband said that the man should not have backed into the spot and just talked to her if he needed it that badly. I told him that I do understand that it was scary for my sister-in-law and that it was messed up for the man to back in. But ultimately, no one is entitled to a public parking spot, and she shouldn't have put herself and the baby in the street to begin with. They decided to leave when they couldn't get me to agree with them, and my husband and I felt bad because sister-in-law genuinely was shaken up, just wondering if we were the jerks and should apologize and make peace. And now with some comments on a post. Someone saying, "Not the jerk. She kind of used the child as a tool to get the parking spot. This is a damn stupid idea. I understand she was shaken, but that doesn't magically change the situation she put herself and a baby in." Another commenter adds, "Not the jerk. Aside from the fact that, in my opinion, trying to hold a parking spot is a jerk thing to do, doing it with a baby is dangerous. The guy gave her plenty of time to move. As for if he needed the spot, he should have talked to her. What? He should have blocked the street and asked her to move, which of course she would have done? This is the same lady that called him evil for taking a publicly available parking spot. You responded correctly, acknowledged that it scared her, and didn't call her a ninny for standing in the street with her baby. They took offense over you not wholeheartedly agreeing that they had the right to that space. Because, baby, you are in the right, but this also seems like a strange hill to die on. Let things cool down and then reach out. Your sister-in-law may be reasonable when she's not shaken up. A third commenter goes with, "Not that jerk. She pretty much tried to use a baby as a traffic cone. She's lucky the guy wasn't unhinged or road ragey enough to gun it backwards and take them both out. I think part of her anger at you is her knowing she did something stupid, but is ashamed to admit it, so she's being defensive." And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching and see you next time.